I didn't realize someone was inside my house until I heard breathing right outside my bedroom door. And the moment I noticed it, my entire body froze because I knew there was absolutely no one else supposed to be in the house that night. My parents had left town earlier that afternoon for a weekend trip, and I was staying home alone for the first time in a while, which honestly felt kind of exciting at first. The house felt bigger and quieter than usual, and after they left, I spent most of the evening doing normal things like ordering pizza, watching random videos online, and enjoying the rare silence of the house with no one else around. It was the middle of winter, the kind of cold night where the streets empty out early and the entire neighborhood becomes quiet except for the occasional sound of wind moving through bare trees. Around midnight, I shut off the TV downstairs and headed upstairs to my room. But before I went up, I walked through the kitchen to grab a drink and noticed something slightly strange. The back door was unlocked. That wasn't completely impossible because sometimes my dad forgot to lock it when he left in a hurry, so I didn't think too much about it at the time. I just turned the lock, made sure the door was shut tight, and went upstairs. Looking back now, that small moment is a part one replay the most in my head because I still wonder if the person who ended up inside the house was already there before I locked that door. At the time, though, everything felt normal. I went into my room, turned on a small lamp, and spent the next hour lying on my bed scrolling through my phone. The house was silent in that deep late-night way where every tiny sound feels louder than it should. Around 1:30 in the morning, I finally turned off the lamp and lay there in the dark, still awake but getting tired, when I heard the first noise from downstairs. It was faint, just a small creak somewhere below me, and I didn't react to it at first because old houses make noises all the time, especially when the temperature outside drops and the wood contracts. I ignored it and kept staring at my phone until a few seconds later, I heard another sound. This time it was a little more distinct, like a foot pressing slowly onto a wooden floorboard. I paused what I was watching and sat up slightly in bed, listening carefully into the darkness of the hallway outside my room. For almost a full minute, nothing happened. The house stayed quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Eventually, I told myself I was just imagining things and leaned back down onto my pillow. That's when I heard it again. A slow step, then another. The sound was unmistakable now, and the realization that it couldn't be the house settling made my stomach tighten instantly. Someone was walking downstairs. My first thought was that maybe my parents had come home early from their trip. But that idea didn't make sense because they would call or at least turn on lights when they came inside. Instead, the house remained completely dark and silent, except for those slow, careful footsteps. I sat there holding my breath, trying to convince myself there had to be some normal explanation, but then I remembered something that made the situation worse. I had locked the back door earlier that night. If someone had entered the house after that, I would have heard the door open, which meant the only other possibility was that whoever was downstairs had already been inside the house before I locked it. My heart started pounding as I slowly slid out of bed and walked quietly toward my bedroom door. I didn't open it, but I pressed my ear close enough to hear more clearly. The footsteps continued moving around downstairs for another moment before stopping completely. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise itself, like whoever was down there had realized someone might be listening. I stood there for several seconds without moving, trying to decide what to do, when suddenly I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the staircase. It was soft, almost like someone testing the first step to see if it would creak. A second later, I heard the wooden stair groan slightly under weight. Someone had started walking upstairs. The staircase in our house leads directly to the hallway where my bedroom is located, which meant whoever was climbing those steps would end up only a few feet away from me. I quietly stepped back from the door and grabbed the baseball bat leaning against the wall beside my closet. My hands were already shaking as I gripped it. The footsteps continued climbing the stairs slowly, one at a time, each step separated by a few seconds, as if the person was trying to move without making noise. The sound of the wood creaking under their weight echoed through the hallway. By the time they reached the top of the staircase, my heart was pounding so loudly I was afraid they might actually hear through the door. Then the footsteps stopped completely. Whoever was had reached the hallway, and they were standing right outside my room. I stood there in the dark, gripping the baseball bat as tightly as I could while staring at my bedroom door, trying to control my breathing, because every instinct in my body was telling me not to make a single sound. The hallway light was off, so the only illumination in the room came from the faint glow of my phone screen lying on the bed behind me. For several seconds, nothing happened, and that silence somehow felt worse than the footsteps had. It was a kind of silence where your brain starts imagining every possible scenario at once. Then, slowly, the doorknob moved. It didn't turn all the way, just a small movement, like someone gently testing it to see if it was locked. My stomach dropped instantly because I had locked it earlier without even thinking about it. Whoever was outside the door must have realized that too, because the knob stopped moving and the hallway went quiet again. I thought maybe they would try to force the door open, but instead something even more unsettling happened. I heard a quiet voice right outside the door whisper the word hello. It wasn't loud or threatening. If anything, it sounded calm and curious, like someone checking whether the house was empty. That was the part that made it terrifying. Whoever was standing there didn't sound nervous at all. I stayed completely silent, barely breathing, hoping the person would assume no one was home and leave. After a few seconds, a footsteps started again, moving slowly away from my door and toward the staircase. I listened carefully as the wood creaked under their weight while they walked back down to the first floor. My entire body stayed frozen for another minute before I finally allowed myself to move again. I quietly picked up my phone and checked the security cameras we had outside the house. The driveway camera showed nothing except snow falling under the streetlight. The front porch camera showed an empty walkway and the faint outline of the mailbox near the street. The backyard camera showed the fence and the dark trees, behind it moving slightly in the wind. Everything outside looked completely normal, but the person I had heard was inside the house, and there were no cameras inside to tell me where they were now. Just as I was trying to decide whether I should call the police, my phone suddenly vibrated in my hand. The sound felt unbelievably loud in the silent room. It was a text message from my mom asking if I had left the back door unlocked. Seeing that message made my blood run cold, because I knew I had locked it earlier. That meant whoever had been inside the house had unlocked it again at some point. Right after that realization, I heard fast movement downstairs, much louder than before, followed by the unmistakable sound of the back door opening. A rush of cold winter air seemed to move through the house as the door slammed shut again a moment later. Then everything went silent. I stayed in my room for nearly 15 minutes, too afraid to move, before finally calling the police and explaining what had happened. It took them about 10 minutes to arrive, and when they searched the house, they didn't find anyone inside. Every door and window was checked, every room was cleared, and eventually one of the officers told me it looked like whoever had been there had already left before they arrived. At first, that made me feel slightly relieved, but then another officer who'd been walking around the backyard came back and asked me to step outside with him for a moment. The snow in the yard had captured footprints clearly. There was one trail of prints leading away from the back door toward the trees behind the fence. But right next to them was another trail of footprints that had come from the opposite direction earlier. The officer crouched down and pointed at the older set partially covered by fresh snow. He explained that those prints had likely been there for hours before the newer ones. In other words, the person who ran from the house had already been somewhere near the property long before I even got home that evening. That realization hit me harder than anything else that night, because if those footprints had been there earlier, it meant the person might have entered the house while it was still empty and waited inside without making a sound until I returned. When I thought about the unlocked back door again, the entire situation suddenly made sense in the worst possible way. Whoever had been inside probably watched the house for a while, realized no one was home, slipped inside the back door, and then stayed hidden somewhere in the dark rooms downstairs while I spent hours completely unaware that someone else was there. The officer eventually told me something I still think about to this day, based on the timing of the snow covering the footprints. He believed the person might have been inside the house for several hours before I even went upstairs at night, which means while I was sitting downstairs eating pizza and watching videos, someone could have been standing quietly in the hallway or hiding somewhere just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to move. I never stayed alone in that house again after that night. And even now, whenever I hear a small creak in a quiet building, I instantly remember the sound of those footsteps slowly climbing the stairs toward my room. For the next few days after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what the officer had said about the footprints in the snow. The idea that someone might have been inside the house for hours before I even got home made my skin crawl every time I walked through the hallway or heard the floor creak somewhere in the house. My parents tried to reassure me that the police had already searched every room and that whoever had been there was long gone. But something about the situation never felt completely settled. A week later, my dad asked me to help him move some old storage boxes from the basement so he could reorganize the space. I remember walking down the basement stairs and instantly noticing a strange smell, like stale air mixed with something damp. At first, I assumed it was just a usual basement smell, but when we started moving boxes near the back corner behind the furnace, my dad suddenly stopped and looked down at the floor. Tucked between the wall and a stack of old paint cans was something that definitely hadn't been there before. It was a thin blanket, a half-empty bottle of water, and several empty food wrappers. For a moment, neither of us said anything. My dad slowly crouched down and picked up one of the wrappers, turning it over in his hand as if trying to understand how it got there. Then he looked up at me and said something that made my stomach drop instantly. He said those things weren't there the last time he cleaned the basement before leaving for the trip. That meant someone had placed them there recently. The police had searched the house the night I called them and said they found nothing, which meant whoever had been inside must have hidden well enough that they missed it. The thought that someone could have been sleeping in our basement while I was upstairs that night made my chest tighten. But the part that still bothers me the most happened later that evening, when I went back to my room. As I was closing the door, I noticed something small on the wooden floor right outside the hallway. At first, I thought it was just dirt from someone's shoes. But when I leaned down and looked closer, I realized it was actually a faint muddy footprint. A footprint that looked fresh, and it was facing my bedroom door. The strange thing was that it didn't lead anywhere else in the hallway. There were no other prints going toward the stairs, none going into another room. Just that single footprint sitting right outside my door, like someone had been standing there again. I asked my parents about it later, but neither of them had been upstairs since we moved the boxes from the basement. That was the moment I started wondering about something I hadn't considered before. If the police never found the person that night, and if someone had been hiding in our basement long enough to leave food and water there, then maybe the footsteps I heard leaving to the back door weren't the only ones in the house. And sometimes late at night, when the house is completely quiet, I still hear the same slow creaking sound coming from somewhere downstairs, like someone carefully walking across a wooden floor, trying not to be heard.